So today is kind of going to be, and I'll mention this, of course, in the intro here, but it's sort of a bridge between the older topic and then the newer work that I'm going to be doing here coming up. Okay, so in 1926, in the very last speech he gave as chairman of the Burma Corporation, one of the largest and most productive mining enterprises in the British Empire at the time, Francis Gavett spoke proudly of the new deal that he had helped craft between several of the empire's major mining companies in the interwar years. Gavett noted that, quote, the formation of the National Smelting Company, end quote, as it was now called, was, quote, something like the coping stone of the movement of British cooperation, in which it has plainly worked out for us, the Burma Corporation, to take our part, end quote. Arguing against the notion that the scheme was an amalgamation of the empire's existing firms, Gavett claimed that the deal would instead establish a working alliance between the companies in an effort to supplant German supremacy in extracting and smelting metalliferous ores and to allow Britain to operate independently from foreign reliance and intervention. Quoting Cecil Rhodes, Gavett summed up his opinions by saying that, quote, our politics are in a nutshell, that our whole business is the receipt of raw material, working it up into the manufactured article, and its ultimate distribution over the world, and we shall be great only so long as we keep our empire, end quote. As much as the empire needed business, it was also clear that businessmen like Gavett needed the empire. Gavett's statements, which took place only days before his untimely passing, came on the heels of nearly a decade of backroom deals and politicking from within the British Empire's broader community of mining elites to fashion an in-house British Imperial metalliferous ore industry. However, though Gavett's statements about the mining industry's need for empire, or even the idea that there would be a British imperially focused trade, may seem fairly straightforward or unsurprising to us today, especially if you think of other empire-focused businesses in this period, tea, textiles, other commodities, etc. The reality is that the fashioning of the empire-focused mining industry was actually quite controversial at the time. In fact, while there's no question that mining as an industry was critical to the British Empire, whether at mines within the empire itself, or more broadly in providing things like currency or munitions to help fuel, build, or provide the literal scaffolding of empire globally, including, of course, in guns, ships, telegraph lines, railways, you name it, mining had actually long been a more open and globalized industry, and British mining agents could be found not just in British imperial spaces, but basically all over the world, including in Latin America, North America, Russia, and elsewhere in Europe, just to name a few places. And of course, this is also vice versa. Within the British Empire itself, there was lots of mining agents from all over the world as well, right? And this is something I'll talk a little bit about with the project with Burma, because that's a big part of what is going on with that story. However, by the time of Gavett's speech, of course, the political and economic situation globally, and for Britain specifically, had changed dramatically from decades and centuries prior. Understanding that a reliance on foreign smelters and foreign sources of ore could prove disastrous owing to the outbreak of another war, something that had obviously happened during World War I with Germany, commercial forces from throughout Britain's current and former empire decided it was high time to ensure such a problem could not happen again, and so they turned inwards to create a new economic community of sorts that could protect Britain and its commercial and security interests from its potential rivals. And so that's the topic that I'm going to turn to today. So to uncover the story, I'm actually, like I said, going to take a somewhat unorthodox approach. I'm going to go back in time a bit to my first book project on the Burma Corporation and the Bodmin mining complex to show why this question over the entanglement between empire mining and the commercial world is such a difficult one to parse out. After that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of broader British imperial world, especially of financial elites that were part of these kind of backroom deals to sort this situation out at a kind of broader level. And then finally, I'm going to end by discussing the Imperial Institute, which played an important role in the story, and that is going to be the focus of my next book project. And I will say, so I presented at the MHA 2 years ago when we were at Park City, but I actually ended up presenting on something of a side project, which included James Douglas and Bisbee and some of that, because I was really kind of interested in his story as an imperial man in a sense, but I've actually not presented on the Burma stuff here. So I figured this is a good time to do that since the project is kind of ending now and I'm moving on to this other stuff, but of course it is all connected with where I'm heading next anyways. Okay, so first the Burma Corporation. So my first book project, The Commonwealth of Empire, focuses exclusively on this company, which operated at the Bodmin mines in what during the British colonial era was known as the Northern Shan states of British Burma. These mines, which actually had a history of extraction that long predated the arrival of colonialism around the turn of the 20th century, by the 1920s and 30s, it was one of the world's most important sources of silver, lead, and zinc. While that story alone is worth telling, the reason I initially became interested in those mines was the personnel involved in the operations. And this was because while the Burma Corporation, which was the corporation that owned the enterprise, was technically registered in London and the mines themselves were located within the territorial limits of British Burma, there were actually very few British or Burmese people who were actually living or working there. Instead, while the many thousands of workers who labored at the site primarily hailed from China, India, and Nepal, the ownership group, as well as most of the management team and engineers at the site, were actually from the United States and Australia and Canada, and elsewhere around the so-called Anglo or British world, which included Herbert Hoover, who helped to actually found the Burma Corporation prior to World War I. And the other major stakeholder at the time was the Australian Richard Tilden Smith. But this was a big project for Hoover, actually, and his name is always the one that's been sort of attached to the Burma Corporation. Now, while much of this first book project tries to understand the complicated relationship between transnational corporations and the British Empire in the late colonial era, basically thinking about how corporations came to operate as state agents in places far from state control. One thing I discovered while working on this project is that, of course, these policies and relationships changed with the onset of World War I, when Britain's more open-door free trade policies had to be scrapped owing to security concerns. In the case of the Burma Corporation, what this meant was a change in ownership. While before the war, figures like Hoover and other American capitalists were highly involved in the operations, the passing of the Trading with the Enemies Act during the war created a new environment for global capitalist agents hoping to profit from the British Empire's large footprint in the global south, and many of those figures were actually ousted from these companies. And obviously this didn't just include Germans, who were of course very much involved in these operations all over the place, including in the British Empire, but also other foreign nationals such as Americans. And so basically Hoover during this time, he fought it, but he ultimately ends up having to sell his shares in the company, relinquish his role as chairman, and George Nash, who is Hoover's sort of primary biographer, who did a lot of work with the Presidential Library and stuff like that, basically argues that this becomes the basis of his fortune, right? So he ends up going into the Belgian Relief Fund efforts during the war, working within the Food Administration and things like that afterwards, but this becomes the basis of his money to go into politics later in time. So it's basically how he got rich. So it was this shift from a globally oriented industry to an imperial one that Francis Godet was referencing in the speech that I began the talk with. Basically in the 1920s, the Burma Corporation became embedded within a larger conglomerate, which was known as the National Smelting Company, which combined the interests of several of the British Empire's most important mining companies and financial elites, particularly the Australian W.S. Robinson, who's pictured on the slide here, who became one of the new leading figures of the firm. But while these shifts in ownership and the intentionality behind it was clear for me in the archives, along with the fact that that British imperial interests understood that they needed to change these trade relationships, zinc became a major kind of touching point here, which I'll talk more about here in a second. What I was still having a hard time understanding was how exactly an industry built on global relationships and global movements could suddenly take this kind of inwards turn. When there was no imperial institutional body that governed the metal trade, and it was always understood that the British Empire's mining interests were not beholden to empire, but they were global agents, right, looking for profit basically anywhere they could. And I'm sure, I'm going to emphasize here, even though, again, I know everybody in this room knows this sort of implicitly because we're all working on mining history, but mining, of course, is very unique spatially vis-a-vis other major industries. It not only requires finding finite resources that are often in remote locations, deep within the earth, but then you also have to get those materials out, send them to market, right? And that requires a lot of infrastructure and expertise and manpower and all of this kind of stuff. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this is basically what I'm trying to say here is that the political matters a lot to these stories, right? How do you actually get these materials out of the ground and send them to market? Well, there's lots of layers of power and sovereignty and things like that play into these stories, especially when we're talking about mines that exist out in the empire, right? And so on. So, thus far I've laid out how and why I became interested in the story, which in sum is how the mining industry morphed into from a globalized one to a more empire-focused one, at least in the context of the British Empire. It's worth first discussing why this happened, and in turn why it was actually quite difficult to build these new networks. And so to do so, I want to discuss zinc here for a moment. So while the British Empire contained many ore deposits that contained zinc, including several in Western Australia, as well as at the bottom mines of Burma, of course, the processing and smelting of zinc was actually dominated by German smelters during this period, who more or less completely controlled this aspect of the trade. What this meant was that with the outbreak of war, British zinc concentrates had more or less nowhere to go. While some of the materials were sent to Japan at this time, it was understood that Britain needed their own zinc smelting industry, which at that point more or less did not exists. And of course, zinc was used in a lot of war products, right? This is a matter of national and imperial security. This is a big deal. The fact that these borders are now closed with the continent. And so this is one of the British Empire's most important mining magnates combined to try and jumpstart this new industry. While during World War I, the Minister of Munitions, Winston Churchill, helped create a new zinc smelting factory at Avonmouth, England, which actually was initially used to produce mustard gas for the war. With the fall in metal prices that accompanied the end of the war, the site was later purchased by the National Smelting Company, which I mentioned before, which was the same group that had bought out the Burma Corporation in 1923. This group, which was headed by W.S. Robinson, also had many important connections within the British government, including, importantly, Sir Robert Horne, who was a former MP and Chancellor of the Exchequer, who also served as the chairman of the Burma Corporation for nearly 2 decades during the interwar years. It was really under Horne's leadership that the Burma venture became an economic success, and his career shows just how deeply embedded state and private interests became during the 20s and 30s in reference to the mining industry. And this is just an overhead shot of the Swansea Vale Avonmouth works, which are in Wales. Horne, in fact, was the leader of many of these efforts to fuse British imperial interests to the mining world. During the early 30s, when the world was reeling from an economic depression of global proportions, Horne was a strong voice in favor of moving Britain away from the gold standard to a new silver standard, which was in part the result of the fact that the British Empire had much stronger access to silver reserves, owing to the many silver mines that existed within its territories. And of course, the Burma Corporation is one of those, right? So, not surprising that the chairman of a silver mining company would, think highly of silver and want, that to go up and things like that. Obviously, he had a, personal financial stake in what was going on here. But it's also through Horne, and specifically Horne's personal papers, which were held at the University of Glasgow, that I started to get a sense of how the metal industry became linked to the British Empire, at least in a more institutional sense. So again, so far I've been mostly talking about these kind of financial and governmental elites, seeing these shifting interests, but what about at the kind of institutional level here, which is what I'm interested in. Well, obviously, again, it's a bit complicated, but it was near the end of World War I in 1917 that the British government created what was called the Imperial Mineral Resources Bureau, a body that was based in London and that represented Great Britain, the Dominions, India, and other parts of the empire. The group, the creation of which was recommended at the Imperial War Conference of 1917, as well as by the Ministry of Munitions, was made up of leaders from Britain and the empire's many technical institutes that, quote, are most closely in touch with the exploitation of our mineral deposits and the utilization of their products, end quote, and that could advise on matters related to the metal trade. The group was initially headed by Sir James Stephenson, who is best known today as being the namesake of the later Stephenson Plan, which is a protectionist effort to lower global rubber prices, but later fell under the direction of Sir Richard Redmayne, a former mining engineer who was one of the leading voices of the industry in Britain at the time. Now, scholars have recently uncovered how the IMRB operated during this period, and this is actually an article that just came out. I think this came out after I had pitched this to multiple places. It includes a title that's very similar to the one that I'm using here today. But again, some of you might recognize some of the names here: Andrew Pershard, Roy McLeod, and Jeremy Moat. Jeremy's one of the few scholars that's also worked on anything involving the Burma Corporation or anything like that. But they actually just published this a few months ago talking about the IMRB and the same kind of issues that I'm kind of thinking through here. It's in business history. But the thing I'm more interested in here, actually, is the next step in the development of an empire-centered mining interest group, which occurred in 1925, when the IMRB merged with the Imperial Institute, an institution that today is probably best known not for anything it actually accomplished, but rather for its very famous building, which later became part of the campus of Imperial College in London. So the Queen's Tower, so the tower there kind of on the left, is the only remaining remnant of that building that was created at the end of the 19th century, but it's part of Imperial College today. So it was the building was torn down in the 1950s and became, again, part of Imperial College. However, the Imperial Institute, which few scholars have actually published on, was initially established in 1887 after Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, and was effectively a cultural economic organization designed to promote the British Empire and its many commodities and products. It was actually a sort of pet project from the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward, to set this whole thing up. With the merger, the Mines Bureau became the Mineral Department of the Imperial Institute, and it was from there that all macro policy decisions were at least meant to be crafted under the direction of a board of directors, which included high commissions from the dominions in India and representatives from the Treasury, the Board of Trade, which included the Mines Department, the Colonial Office, and the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research, among others. And there's also folks from Kew Gardens, various chambers of commerce, all sorts of things like that. In terms of minerals and metals, the group was involved in several tasks. This included work on intelligence and publications, laboratory and scientific investigations, as well as legal concerns. And so I'm going to I'll show you some images here in a little bit of what this kind of looked like. There's actually a great repository of images in their records, which are held at the National Archives in Kew. Ultimately, really what this became was an exhibitionary space. It really became a sort of museum of empire. But again, I'll talk a little bit more about that here coming up. And so it was under the direction of this new body that the empire's various mining interests, whether in finance, expertise, trade, etc., became centralized in government for the very first time. However, it should be noted that from what I can tell at this stage of my research, the group accomplished very little, at least in regards to its kind of main political mission, that idea of centralizing all of these efforts. In 1927, for example, Sir Richard Redmayne was a guest of honor at the Second Triennial Mining and Metallurgical Congress in Canada, where he gave a speech in which he noted the aims of the Imperial Institute in regards to mining. Quote, "An advantage of such a gathering as that under consideration, and one of particular value to the Imperial Institute, is that resulting from the interchange of ideas of men congregating from all parts of the empire and concerned in the furtherance of similar objects," end quote. While the conference allowed for the, quote, "establishment of pleasant relations and conduced to a free and frank exchange of views," he continued, one was also enabled to understand the Dominion point of view from observations made on the spot, to comprehend the difficulties to be surmounted and the wants to be met, and to ascertain in what directions the mineral section of the Imperial Institute can be made of greater use, end quote. This pitch, and some to try and fuse industrial expertise from across the British Empire and the broader British world, though unstated here, but then again I've seen sort of in the archives, to in the longer term create an economic bloc of Britain's colonies and dominions around mineral resources, was one that Redmayne and his successors would repeat over and over again, often using the same language that was presented in Canada in the 1920s. And as a complete and total aside, when I was first creating this presentation for a conference a couple months ago, I was Googling Sir Richard Redmayne to try and find a good image of him, and all I could get was Eddie Redmayne. And that is because Eddie Redmayne is his grandson, which is completely random, but kind of fun at the same time. Okay, so here are some images I just want to show you here quickly of what this all kind of looks like. And again, all of this comes from the archives. So the Imperial Institute, unlike the Burma Corporation, which did not have a corporate archive, unfortunately, which forced me to go a lot of places to figure out that story, there is a corporate archive for the Imperial Institute, and it's at Kew in London. And so this is just a map of the building itself. It's a beautiful building. It was a huge deal when it was inaugurated. The Queen, went herself. I think there was tens of thousands of people there lined up. It was this whole, to-do at the time. Again, over time, that kind of, zealousy around the project kind of faded, quite quickly, I would argue. But to get a kind of scale of what this all looked like, so for anybody who's been to London and never been to the Natural History Museum, you would know that that is a very large building at the Natural History Museum. This is bigger, actually, and it's right behind it, so it's right in between the Royal Albert Hall and then where right now is the Natural History Museum. It's actually quite a bit bigger than there. I think that when they tore down the building in the 1950s, a lot of the materials that are in the minerals room at the Natural History Museum, again, if you've been there, they have a fantastic, massive space of minerals from all over the empire and all over the world. They actually have a big collection of Mogok rubies from Burma, for example, and things like that. Anyways, I think a lot of it came from the Imperial Institute, which I'll show you some images of here in a second. In terms of some mining stuff, so I mean, again, what the building ended up becoming was something of a museum of sorts, and so these are just some images of some of the dioramas that existed in there, again, not unlike, say, the New York, Natural History Museum, that kind of thing. So the one on the top are the oil fields in Yenyang, Burma, which are very famous during the early 20th century, and then on the bottom is a diorama from a coal mine in Bengal. And again, obviously, they're really highlighting spaces in the empire, so places like India, Malaysia, or Malaya at the time, various colonies in West Africa, South Africa, et cetera, are highlighted more so than other spaces, but again, this was a big part of what they're displaying in there. This here, you can see a part of the Australian section, and so the way that the museum was laid out, I don't know if you could see on that map before, each part of the building was set up geographically according to different parts of the empire. So there was an Australia wing, which was at like the southeast corner of the building, and then, so it was all centered around London or Britain as the center, and then moving kind of outwards here. But again, as you can see in this one, these are some of the minerals that are on display in the Australia exhibit, and you can see Western Australia there, which of course very much focused on metals and things like that. These are some images from some of the scientific labs that they held on site at the Imperial Institute. I don't know, just people in lab coats doing science, I guess. There was a bunch of these, but effectively, they were taking in all these materials from all over the world and then running tests on them, which again, I'll talk about here in a second, but with the idea to try and sell this stuff to capitalists and agents who they could then go out in the empire and extract these things for profit, right? It's really kind of like a booster sort of project that's going on here. But again, this technical part of the organization was a really important component beginning in the 1920s once everything kind of moved here. So, I'm going to actually just go back here quick. So as Redmayne's comments sort of hint at, though, the biggest issue that confronted groups like the Imperial Institute and those in the mining industry who sought greater centralization was one that in the context of the late colonial period is perhaps unsurprising. The increasing fragmentation of empire and pushing it even further, right, the end of empire in an era of decolonization. With the complexity of Britain's colonial holdings and the uneven sovereignties, administrations, and degrees of autonomy that existed across colonial contexts, from directly and indirectly governed colonies in Asia and Africa, to the array of formal and informal links that existed between the white dominions and the United Kingdom at this time, with many of these former colonies, Australia, Canada, and elsewhere, becoming their own nations, right, all in this moment. A simple exchange of ideas may have been possible, but the building of more official connections through a governmental agency centered in London was more or less utopian. As Pershard et al. Have shown, and as I have argued elsewhere, the responsibility instead fell on the shoulders of those private interests in the empire. The Horns, the Robinsons, etc., who could fashion an imperial industry through amalgamation and conglomeration, buying up mining operations in different parts of the empire, and buying and selling the fruits of those enterprises from within an imperially or British world-bounded system. And then, of course, by extension, using their links in government to push for financial protections, tariffs, et cetera, when it mattered. Just like the Imperial Institute itself, which was founded to try and centralize Britain's empire, and from a policy-making perspective to govern the empire under one roof, the IMRB and later the Mineral Section of the Imperial Institute were ultimately a failure, unable to bridge the divides that defined Britain's global empire project, which despite their exertions could never have been, borrowing a phrase, just quote-unquote one big thing. And honestly, it was really, from what I could tell in the archives, and again, it's still kind of early days going through all these materials, there was a lot of pushback from especially the Dominion side of things, right? So in the 1920s, it's really Australia and Canada. Australia at one point for several years just withdrew their funding. And so one problem that the Imperial Institute ran into basically the entire time was a funding issue. They never were set up with a proper endowment, even though it was a pet project of royalty. And so they were constantly scrapping to try and get donations from the colonies to support these things, basically saying, hey, we're promoting you here in London. We're getting people to come and buy your commodities, to go out and invest in your places. But as time is going on and as these new nations are being established, that those links are less and less important, right? And so, again, Canada and Australia in particular were kind of pushing back in those early days. India by the 1930s, 1940s, certainly, with the rise of a pretty marked anti-colonial nationalism, are also rejecting these groups because they see it as a violation of sovereignty in a certain sense, right? Saying we can do this ourselves. We don't need your help. We certainly aren't going to give you thousands of pounds to go put our minerals on display or something as if that's going to do anything for us. And so there is this big pushback here that's going out. And so, again, as I was mentioning, the site itself really just becomes a museum over time. Certainly by the 40s and, really by the 40s, it's for school groups in Britain to come and see empire, right? It's an exhibitionary space, and that becomes its primary mission. And in fact, by 1951, they end up just cutting all the funding for any of the scientific and technical stuff that's going on. At that point, it's just a museum. And so that, it ends up failing here over time. They actually rebrand the institution, the Commonwealth Institute, in 1951 as well, and that's around the time that they tear it down, and they move into a different part of the city, and then Imperial takes over at the site and things like that. But anyways, it is quite interesting, and again, there's lots of great images of all this stuff, the constant remaking of these spaces to kind of fit how people were thinking about empire at various moments and stuff like that. Okay, so what does this all tell us? So first, I think these debates and shifts in the mining industry in the interwar years do show us the unevenness of globalization, revealing that while there were plenty of schemes to try and fashion a more closed system of trade focused around the British Empire and its colonies, at least in the realm of minerals, that those ideas often ran counter to an industry that over the modern period had relied on and really developed from its global connections. And owing to that, there was a great deal of resistance to these sorts of efforts, especially outside of Britain. Second, I think the story uncovers the important role that private enterprise played in the domain of national and imperial policymaking around mining as an industry, taking on state-like roles when the government was unable for various factors to direct and guide these policies, right? And it's really these agents, the W.S. Robinsons of the world, who become really the prime advocates and real movers of economic centralization to a certain degree, right? But it's really kind of more of a private imperial centralization that's happening here. It's quite interesting in that way. And then third, and related to that last point, and perhaps what I'm becoming most interested in with this story, is that I think the mining industry's entanglement within an effectual body like the Imperial Institute also shows the limits in some cases between public and private partnerships in this period, and in particular how schemes to centralize the empire as an economic and commercial entity failed. I find that failure, as much as success, can reveal much about the nature of business history, of capitalism, of empire, and I think that the Imperial Institute, in particular, is worthy of much closer scrutiny, particularly in its connections to the global mining industry, than scholars have heretofore given it, despite and perhaps even because of its failures as a political, economic, and cultural institution in the early to mid-20th century. So, thank you.
First, before I get started, thanks so much to my fellow panelists, to Ginny for chairing, to the Mining History Association that supported some of this research with a grant a couple of years back, and thanks as well to all of you for attending today's talk. This talk is part of a book in progress tentatively titled Bloodstained Rocks, which explores the human history of the Navassa Islands. And for the book, I'm looking to center the experiences, in particular, of some of the phosphate miners who worked the island. And of the thousands of black men that worked Navassa over the years, we only know the stories of a few of them, and one of them is at the center of this talk, a young black Baltimorean named Richard Anderson. So I'll go ahead and get started. There were numerous reasons why Richard Anderson might want to get out of Baltimore for a spell. Though born free, he was also black, and the 19-year-old could not escape slavery's long shadow. By 1857, tensions in the nation and in the city had reached a fever pitch. The Fugitive Slave Act, passed roughly 7 years previous, threatened Anderson's freedom on a daily basis. Federal laws were not the only ones he worried about. Maryland politicians made calls to re-enslave or to expel the state's free black population. State law, in fact, deputized white men to arrest and jail African Americans on mere suspicion that they had self-emancipated. The Baltimore Police Department apprehended suspected runaways for potential sale. This was a practice rife with abuses, as you can imagine, and errors that helped make Maryland the second largest source for enslaved people sold in the intrastate slave trade. Whether Anderson ever saw the coffles of enslaved people who marched down Pratt Street in Baltimore to the slave pens of traders like the notorious Austin Woolfolk is not known. But Anderson certainly would have been aware of slavery's importance in the nation and in Baltimore. Both of these made his freedom precarious and constantly weighed on his mind. For Anderson, life in Baltimore was difficult. In addition to prejudicial laws and the numerous threats to his freedom, he encountered challenges born of low pay, dangerous working conditions, and a poor city economy impoverished further by anti-black racism. The city's racially stratified job market exacted a particular toll on Baltimore's black community, struggling with the fallout of the national economic collapse in 1857. Already, the decade had witnessed a 20% decline in black employment. The poor economy was not the only reason for this. White and immigrant workers violently policed employment opportunities by attacking black working men during this period, limiting economic opportunity by force. Anderson worked as a drayman, and this made him vulnerable. It was a dangerous occupation. Day in and day out, and I apologize, these dates in the conversion process, the dates were much larger. All of these stories come from the late 1850s, though. It was a dangerous occupation. Day in and day out, Anderson endured blistering heat, frigid winter days, rain, sleet, and snow, as he drove a horse to haul the goods, raw ingredients, and other cargoes that propelled Baltimore's economy. Sitting behind his horse, he dodged men, women, and children, as well as other draymen that could carelessly wander into his horse's path. City newspapers, as these examples demonstrate, regularly reported on accidents that draymen occurred while performing their labor. Anderson may have considered any one of these reasons, or a combination of them, when he accepted the offer to work on Navassa Island. Guaranteed work, after all, was nothing to dismiss in the faltering and racially prescribed economy of the late 1850s. Being out of the country, even for a short spell, promised to at least temporarily relieve Anderson of the difficulties of life in Baltimore. Anderson's thoughts, unfortunately, however, are lost to history. His connection to Navassa is only documented through a bureaucratic fluke of sorts. He was among the first laborers, black laborers, to work on the island during its 40-year history as a phosphate mine. This is the only time that I know of, or that I found, that the Baltimore port recorded the workers that came back from Navassa Island. This is March 1858, very early in the island's history as a phosphate mine. When he returned on board the brig Romance in March 1858, Navassa was not yet a U.S. possession. Port officials likely didn't know how to classify the island, so they treated the Romance as if it had arrived from a foreign port. The ship's captain, Peter Duncan, recorded the names of 14 laborers, including Anderson. No one bothered to record their experiences. Yet the contours of Anderson's working life helps us understand how labor practices developed in the Caribbean as guano entrepreneurs claimed Navassa the United States' first Caribbean possession. The confluence of multiple forces, including slavery, imperialism, and capitalism, helped make Baltimore's guano industry shift to black labor a near certainty. Anderson sat at the leading edge of this shift. He left for Navassa at a key moment in Caribbean phosphate mining history, when black workers replaced the Chinese, or as they were known at the time, coolie workers that the industry had typically exploited. So today I want to explore the push and pull factors that compelled somebody like Richard Anderson and his employers to look towards black laborers to populate the unpopulated phosphate islands in the Caribbean. But first, we should talk about Navassa. The small island, and so this is a painting that was done in the 1870s when Richard Anderson was on the island. He worked up on the upper left-hand side of the island. In time, the mining would shift to the upper right-hand side of the island, but that doesn't come until the 1860s or 1870s. The small island sits between Jamaica and Haiti, roughly 40 miles off Haiti's western coast. And you can see it here. It's an island that is uninhabited due to its lack of fresh water source. Haiti has historic claims to the island, with roots that reach back to the eras of Spanish and then French colonization prior to the Haitian Revolution. The treaty that Haiti signed with France in 1825, made infamous for the indemnities that France leveled on their former colony, further cemented Haiti's claims on Navassa, so the French transferred ownership officially of the island to Haiti in 1825 as part of that treaty. The U.S. ignored these claims when it granted ownership of the island to Edward Oakes Cooper and his son, Edward Kiernan Cooper. We'll talk about both of these men in just a little bit. In the first half of the 19th century, most people in the United States were unaware of Navassa, but interest intensified in the island in the mid-19th century. Due to soil exhaustion, farmers in the mid-Atlantic increasingly sought guano to fertilize their fields, so guano bird poop. Farmers, as well as agricultural periodicals and groups, pressured the government to find an alternative to Peruvian guano, which was then the primary source of fertilizer in the mid-19th century. Peruvian guano, while effective, was expensive and often in short supply. After years of agitation and failed efforts by adventurers to seize islands, mainly throughout the Pacific, the US government passed the 1856 Guano Islands Act. And so before we go further here, the United States did not have diplomatic relations with Haiti until 1861. So in the period before that, they relied upon people like Benjamin C. Clark, who was a commercial agent to Haiti, who kind of acted as a diplomat. This is the way he summed up the claims that Haiti had to the island. These men, white men, were surprisingly sympathetic to Haiti that worked as commercial agents here. So in 1856, the U.S. passes the Guano Islands Act. In short, the law allowed U.S. entrepreneurs to claim an island with guano until its resources were depleted. This is the law that the Coopers used to steal Navassa from Haiti. Confusingly, Navassa contains very little actual guano. Instead, it had large phosphatic deposits that manufacturers combined with things like guano or with sulfuric acid to make a fertilizer, what people refer to at times as either manipulated guano, or sometimes they refer to it as superphosphates at the time. But regardless, in everyday parlance, and as you can see from some of the ads of Navassa's product being sold, almost everybody referred to it as guano. So I'll kind of use both terms interchangeably, but they're actually mining phosphates, not guano on the islands. The imperial dimensions of the Guano Islands Act remain the legislation's most oft-discussed historical legacy. But the legislation also reshaped labor in the Caribbean for the next 40 years. Prior to the legislation, guano prospectors sailed up to islands with small crews of about 10 to 20 men. They mined, they loaded their boats, and then sailed back to the United States. None of the islands that they mined were actually U.S. possessions. In fact, many of them were claimed by other nations, so there was never any pretense to permanence. The idea was to get in and to get out quickly, hopefully prior to attracting any attention from other governments. The crews, as best I can tell in this era, were multiracial in composition. The problem here was land. Without the ability to remain on an island, phosphate mining in the Caribbean remained or promised only irregular and small loads. With the passage of the Guano Islands Act, however, the Coopers realized something revolutionary. The legislation promised to obliterate the choke point in Caribbean phosphate mining by authorizing settlements. No longer would prospectors have to ferry laborers to the island, put them to work, and then ship them home with a cargo full of phosphates. Instead, Anderson became one of the first employees who went to Navassa under contracts measured not in weeks, but rather in months and in years. The legislation effectively cut the ties that had bound workers to a boat and instead tethered them to an island. In Anderson's case, his term on Navassa was brief, most likely lasting about 6 months. By the 1860s, workers would serve 1.5-year tours, a standard contract used throughout Navassa's 40-year existence as a mining colony. Settlement transformed Navassa into a potential gold mine, but it also came at a severe human cost. The Coopers required a pliant labor force that they could force to mine at low labor cost. Thanks to incomplete and spotty records, the total number of men like Anderson who worked Navassa over its existence is not known. Yet in its 40 years of operation, it's safe to say that the number easily reached into the thousands. Most of these workers were African American. Many of them were also Black from the wider Atlantic world, including Jamaica, Haiti, Nova Scotia. And this was no accident. This turn to Black labor was born out of some of the same historical and contemporary forces that pushed somebody like Richard Anderson to consider Navassa. The Guano Islands Act provided new opportunities then for exploitation. The legislation said nothing about race. Where or how entrepreneurs recruited workers was left at the discretion of individuals. But for Baltimore's maritime entrepreneurs, men like the Coopers, there was no doubt that they would turn to Black laborers. Their decision to use Black miners was consistent with both their lives and their experiences. It likely did not even require a second thought. As a ship captain, the elder Cooper honed his maritime chops in the carrying trade of the 1820s and 1830s, likely delivering provisions on outbound trips to Caribbean islands, and on return, he carried coffee, the fruit of enslaved labor from places like St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands. In his domestic life, Cooper more directly benefited from slavery. The 1830 census noted that the elder Cooper owned an enslaved girl under the age of 10. In a larger sense, though, Baltimore's waterfront and its maritime industries relied on a host of Black laborers, enslaved and free, to keep the port humming. The Coopers also likely knew that Baltimore's fertilizer miners were increasingly Black even before they get into the phosphate game. The trend started a few years previous. In September of 1854, a reporter for the Baltimore Sun happened upon one of the shipping offices in the city, and there he noticed something that he had not seen before. Quote, young, stout, and hardy, end quote, Black men who did not appear to be sailors had been lining up outside the office. When the reporter inquired, he learned that, quote, over 100 had already gone from Baltimore for guano mining opportunities abroad. This reporter stumbled upon a change happening midstream. This was a decidedly new feature, the reporter observed. He knew that guano mining had historically been built on racial exploitation of a different sort. Hitherto, the reporter wrote, most of the labor had been performed by importation from China. In time, these entrepreneurs would expand this practice of using Black miners to the Caribbean. When Anderson agreed to work on Navassa, the rules governing his life shifted to the labor provisions that were outlined by the Guano Islands Act. When crafting the legislation, the bill's sponsor, William H. Seward, decided to regulate labor on Guano Islands as if this labor was being performed aboard a ship. He framed this as a stopgap measure. Section 6 of the law read, quote, that until otherwise provided by law, all acts done and offenses or crimes committed on every such island, rock, or keys by persons who may land thereon or in the waters adjacent thereto shall be held and deemed to have been done or committed on the high seas, on board a merchant ship or vessel belonging to the United States. Stopgap or not, the legislation was never amended. In the eyes of the law, therefore, Navassa was a ship. It was an absurdity, but one that had very real meaning for men like Richard Anderson. The legislation invested nearly uncontested power in the island's superintendents, who stood in as the equivalent of a captain. For the men who filled these positions, a collection that included many former slave owners, this was a power that they knew full well that they possessed. When George W. Tipton, who served on the island as superintendent throughout the 1880s, wrote his cousin, He bragged that, quote, he was empowered with the same authority as the captain of a man of war. When workers refused to labor, or they stole, or they lied, Tipton could imprison or torture them as he wished. This use of physical violence, the prime accelerant for increased production along the U.S.'s cotton frontier in the 1830s through the 1850s, would be similarly applied on Navassa. When workers like Anderson failed to work, whether in protest or because of illness or injury, management subjected them to shipboard punishments. Throughout its history, Navassa's governors triced workers for refusing to work. And so tricing was used in a lot of maritime industries. And so essentially what happens is, and you can see the guy that's further to the right there, they would hang people up by their thumbs until their feet barely touch the ground, and then would leave them there for hours in many cases in Navassa's story. It was an incredibly painful form of torture. When J.L. Broome, who was in the Marine Corps, visited various prisons as part of a congressional investigation in the 1880s, he sought to better understand this punishment by subjecting himself to it. And he wrote, "I'm quite satisfied from my experience that a man subjected to it for 5 minutes must be severely injured, as both my thumb joints were painful for 2 days from the effects of 40 seconds tricing up." And again, on Navassa, workers reported that they would be left triced up for hours at a time. The Coopers ran Navassa like a plantation. White men were there to make sure that their black employees worked and worked hard. Under threat of torture, Anderson and his co-workers made Navassa both habitable and mineable. Anderson likely divided his time on Navassa at the mining site and in construction. During the initial months of habitation, workers erected housing and facilities to store mined phosphates. Shallow waters, coral reefs, rough waters all made it really dangerous for large ships to dock right up alongside Navassa. So instead, they dropped anchor off the coast. And at Navassa's 2 primary shipping points, the men installed a wire rope down which they lowered the bags from the top of the hill to the landing place. Company personnel also used these ropes to come and go from the islands. At the other shipping location, the men employed 2 chutes to load waiting lighters. So lighters are small boats that the men use, then to pilot these small boats out to the waiting ships off the coast, and then they would load the ships actually offshore. The company's chief interest, however, was in mining. When the Coopers stole Navassa, they marveled at the untapped phosphate deposits waiting to be mined. They didn't notice what Anderson could not ignore. The fields, located atop the island's plateau, were a mess of tangled flora. Anderson and his co-workers cleared, quote, the brushwood and small trees that spring up between the stones. They contended with a variety of different shrubs, including the cabbage palm, which one witness noted could grow from 12 to 15 feet. Clearing the mining sites was only part of the problem. The men then needed to connect the dig site to Navassa's harbor. And to reach the wharf, laborers cut a path from the mining sites down to the lower portion of the island. So if we go back here, Anderson and his co-workers helped clear these 2 paths, and then they would load up wheelbarrows and kind of go down these paths down to the waiting shore. And here you can see the boats, again, anchored offshore here because they could not actually get close to the islands. During a stay on the island, and so I should say as well, the island goes about 300 feet, and the path down to the lower part of the harbor could reach 45-degree angles. During his stay on the island, Anderson and his co-workers managed to make the island at least partially operational. With pickaxes in hand, Anderson and his co-workers separated the phosphatic deposits from Navassa's limestone surface. The men then used shovels to load the brownish-red deposits into a cart for delivery to the wharf. The delivery was treacherous. In this earliest days of mining, when Anderson was on Navassa, it seems that workers used wheelbarrows to push their load to the shore. In later years, when the dig site shifted to the other side of the island, the company actually built and installed a narrow gauge railroad that, and constructed cars that could hold up to 2 tons of phosphates at a time. Also incredibly dangerous. I don't have time to talk about it now, but happy to talk about it later on as well. At any rate, by January of 1858, Anderson and his mates had mined 3,000 tons of phosphates, in addition to their work clearing land and building facilities. For a small workforce of approximately 50 to 60 men in this era, the work had to have been done at a breakneck pace. So for a free man like Anderson, the conditions that he faced on Navassa exacted a cruel irony. The Caribbean did not offer Anderson a respite from the dangers of slavery. Instead, on Navassa, he came as close to experiencing enslavement as he ever would in his life. A handful of armed white personnel had held power over Anderson and his co-workers, forcing them to work 6 days a week at a blistering pace. Between 1857 and 1898, the years that the island was operational as a mining site, thousands of black men like Anderson worked under these horrific conditions on Navassa. Though the Guano Islands Act regulated labor, it provided no means of oversight and became the means by which entrepreneurs made Navassa into an industrialized mine. In addition, invested with the power of ship captains, Navassa superintendents kept their workers, like Anderson, underfed, overworked, exposed to disease, and in constant danger. Thank you all so much.